Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Kimmage, and I'm the chair of the Kennan Institute's Advisory Council and also a professor at Catholic University. Thank you so much for joining in for this, the latest installment of our the Longview series, an effort to take a look at US-Russian relations at the post-Soviet space as well, through the best scholarship and the best writing that we can find on the topic. And let me take this chance to sort of advertise future conversations. Keep an eye out for that, because we will have, at the very least, 2 further Longview installments in the spring. As a practical matter, before we really get started, let me say that when you pose a question, you can do so by submitting it, and we have a couple already. You can submit it to kennan@wilsoncenter.org by email. You can submit your questions through Twitter, sort of at Kennan Institute, and you can also use the Facebook page to get your questions. It's my great pleasure to introduce today, I'll put it this way, first, my friend Mary, but also Professor Sarotte for our discussion of her latest book, Not One Inch. Usually we say, and I think it's true in this case, that the author needs no introduction, although I'll give one in a moment. I think we could say in this case, this book needs no introduction at the moment, because it's been, for all the right reasons, splashed across reviews and op-ed pages and public conversations and discussions of the contemporary moment and the issue of where NATO stands and where it stood historically. So this is really, I feel, fully justified in saying the book of the hour. But before we get to this extraordinarily timely new book, let me just say a few words about Professor Sarotte. Professor Sarotte is the Marie Chaussee and Henry R. Kravis Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, DC. In addition to Not One Inch, which is a book that's going to be appearing in many, many languages in the months and years to come, this book has already been named a Foreign Affairs Book of the Year for 2021. Professor Sarotte is also the author of The Collapse, the Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall. This was published 2014. And 1989, The Struggle to Create Post-Cold War Europe, published in 2009, both of which received the Financial Times Book of the Year for their respective years, as well as many other prizes. After completing her graduate education in history at Yale, Professor Sarotte served as a White House Fellow and then joined the University of Cambridge, where she received tenure in 2004, returning after that to the United States to teach at the University of Southern California, and then from there over to the East Coast and to her current position at Johns Hopkins University. It gives me a special pleasure to mention that Professor Sarotte is a former Humboldt Scholar, holder of the German Chancellor Scholarship, as I am, so we will consider this as a conversation among 2 former German Chancellor scholars, talking about NATO, what could be more suitable to the spirit of this particular scholarship. So that by way of introduction, we're delighted to have you with us this afternoon. Mary, let me pass the baton to you for a couple of opening remarks. We'll go from there to a bit of back and forth between the 2 of us, and then we'll open the floor to a broader conversation.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to be here with another Humboldt scholar, a Buka, as we nicknamed ourselves in German. Also wonderful to be here with my friend Michael Kimmage, a major historian of this time period as well. Your work on the abandonment of the West has really been path-breaking. So I'm really delighted and looking forward very much to our interaction. Michael also has a serious policy side as well as a historical side, having worked on Russia issues under the Obama administration. So I'm very, very much looking forward to our conversation and honored to be asked to talk here today, although saddened that we should be doing so under such frightening circumstances where Ukraine is essentially being held hostage to force a do-over of some of the historical battles from the 1990s that I've described in my book, Not One Inch. For me, as someone who went to Germany, not just as a Humboldt scholar, but a while ago when I was even younger, as a student studying abroad in West Berlin in 1989, it's tragic to see how that spirit of optimism and cooperation between the West and the then Soviet bloc, now Russia, has dissipated. And hopefully today we can talk about some of the reasons for that. So I would like to make 4 brief comments, but then get going into a conversation with you. So the first comment comes out of an experience I had at the beginning of the pandemic. One of my other books, I didn't know Michael was going to mention them, so it was very nice of you. One of my other books, The Collapse, near the beginning of the pandemic, was optioned for production as a limited TV series along the lines of the HBO series Chernobyl, so a fictionalized version. Now, I hasten to add that I am not going out and buying a Ferrari yet, because basically that means that instead of a 1 in a million chance of my book becoming a TV series, apparently I have a 1 in 1,000 chance. So it's still a long road, but what it did mean is that I spent part of the pandemic in contact with film producers and screenwriters. And from the screenwriters, I learned something interesting. These are people who live from selling their writing. I am a professor, so if my book doesn't sell, I hope it does, but if it doesn't sell, the lights stay on at my house. There's still food on the table. I still get a salary. But these screenwriters, they have to sell their writing to eat. And so they had lots of tips on selling writing. And one of their tips is that when you're trying to introduce a big audience to a detailed project, as we're doing today, and I understand there's a big crowd here today, that you don't start with the details. You start with the emotional punch. One of the screenwriters said, I go in and I say my script is about what happens when white collar crime comes home. And then you get into the details. So he said, you come up with an emotional image and you give that before you get into the details, so that way people understand why it's important. And I thought, wow, I've never tried to sell a piece of writing like that. I'm a historian, I do details. So I forced myself out of my comfort zone to step back and think, what emotional image would I give to summarize the book, Not One Inch? And this is what I came up with. So imagine that you're swimming in the ocean and you've been carried out by a riptide. You grab onto a log that you think is going to be your deliverance. This book, Not One Inch, is about the moment that deliverance slips away. Now, what I mean by that is the United States and the Soviet Union were in this ever-escalating thermonuclear standoff that got to the point where those two countries could basically end life on Earth. And then they were getting carried away in this riptide of escalation, which, although it had ebbs and flows, it was getting dangerous again in the 80s. And then this remarkable deliverance happened, the unexpected opening of the Berlin Wall, the decisions, the fact that Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader after 3 others died in rapid succession. And the world was delivered from that thermonuclear conflict. And this book is about how neither Washington nor Moscow cherished that deliverance enough and let it slip away, leading to where we are today on the precipice of another conflict. Put differently, Cold Wars are not short-lived affairs, so thaws are precious. And neither the West nor Russia cherished the thaw enough, and now here we are back on the edge of a hot war. So that is the big emotional reason why I cared about this topic and devoted years of my life to trying to get documents declassified and trying to pull this story together and create a shared narrative about how cooperation between the US and Russia disintegrated into today's stalemate. Let me just touch on 3 factual points and then we can move on to the discussion. So first, the 1990 debate. This is something that Putin has now put back in the headlines. It's, of course, the title of my book, Not One Inch. And President Putin started on December 23rd saying, not one inch at press conferences. Ever since then, my life has been slightly surreal. Total strangers started tweeting at me product placement alert when he said that on December 23rd. And I've been inundated with requests from media, from government organizations, and so forth to talk about Not One Inch. So I can get into the weeds on that today. Briefly, that Not One Inch is a reference to a comment made by the US Secretary of State James Baker, as many of you may know, as part of speculative hypothetical discussions about how to unify Germany in the wake of the unexpected opening of the Berlin Wall. It was clear that Germans wanted to unify, but the problem for that was that the unconditional Nazi surrender of 1945 was just that, unconditional. It meant that still in 1989, 1990, the Soviet Union had extensive legal rights over all of Germany and had 380,000 troops there. And so the question was, what would the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, what would he want to give up both those rights and those troops? And so as part of an early hypothetical speculative discussion, the US Secretary of State, James Baker, said to Mikhail Gorbachev something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, but the exact quotation is in my book, Not 1 Inch. James Baker said, how about this? How about you let your half of Germany go, and we agree that NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. And Gorbachev said something to the extent of, that sounds good, certainly NATO should not move eastwards, we should keep talking about this, but nothing formal results. When Baker gets home from that visit to Moscow to Washington to talk to his old friend and boss, President George H.W. Bush, President Bush basically says, Jim, you've leaned too far forward over your skis. I think that NATO should not only persist, but its ability to enlarge should persist. It's been expanding since the 50s, and I think we should move eastward across the Cold War front line, which runs through the middle of Germany, not least because if NATO doesn't move 1 inch eastward, then half of united Germany will be outside of NATO. We'll have a country that's half in and half out. That doesn't make any sense, among other complications. And there's already some early speculative discussion about NATO's role in Central and Eastern Europe. Again, speculative, but it is there. You can see it in the record, and I document it in Not 1 Inch. So Baker agrees, and in one of the newest documents that I present in my book, he immediately writes back to allies in Europe and says, forget what I was saying about not 1 inch eastward, that's causing confusion, we're going to drop that language. But it takes Moscow a while to notice. And so Putin plays on this sense that there was a bait and switch back then. When he does that, Putin is ignoring what happened at the end of the German unification process, which was the final settlement on German unification of September 1990. Gorbachev, in that agreement, changed his priorities. He was unable to get that non-enlargement pledge in writing. He understood the significance of it. As he himself said in 1990, this is from his own records, I told Baker, I am aware of the desire of Central and Eastern European states to leave the Warsaw Pact in order to join NATO later. So this is Mikhail Gorbachev's own notes from May 1990. He knows that it's about Central and Eastern Europe. Despite that, when push comes to shove, he signs the final settlement on Germany in exchange, not for guarantees about NATO, but instead for a huge financial infusion from the West Germans. The deputy national security advisor at the time, Bob Gates, who of course went on to an illustrious career becoming Secretary of Defense, as he put it, we decided on a strategy of bribing the Soviets out. This is Bob Gates. And even better, the West Germans paid the bribe. So that was ultimately what caused Mikhail Gorbachev to let Germany unify. The document itself, the final settlement on Germany, explicitly allows Article 5 to move eastward across the Cold War line, as Bush had wanted. There are certain conditions. It can't move nuclear weapons into Eastern Germany, thus creating the situation that today Eastern Germany is the only part of Europe that is nuclear-free by treaty. But this document, the final settlement on Germany, does allow Article 5 to move eastward across the Cold War line, and Gorbachev authorized signature. So that's the 1990 controversy. Gorbachev has muddied the waters about that because he, in 2014, on the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, tried to improve his historical image by bullying journalists into rewriting this history. So he, in 2014, said to a journalist, he said, NATO expansion never came up when I was in office, never. And then Gorbachev switched to referring to himself in the third person and started dictating to the journalists interviewing him what to write. So this is Gorbachev referring to himself. He says, so don't portray Gorbachev as a naive person. If there was any naivete, it was on the part of later leaders in Moscow. NATO expansion never came up under Gorbachev, not even after the Warsaw Pact collapsed. The problem is that Gorbachev 2014 contradicts Gorbachev 1990, which shows the power of historical research into original sources. Third, and more briefly, the 1997 controversy. The Soviet Union collapses, and then by the mid to late 90s, the question has now arisen under US President Bill Clinton of NATO moving into Central and Eastern Europe. And as that question becomes close to being a reality, it becomes apparent that there is a profound disagreement between Moscow and Washington about the final settlement over Germany. Now, in a rare point of unity, both of them agree that the final settlement is only about Germany. They agree absolutely on that. The problem is that they disagree on the consequences of that reality. For Yeltsin, it means that the permission to move Article 5 eastward across the Cold War line was only for Eastern Germany. It should not go anywhere else. For the West, it means that the movement of Article 5 across the 1989 line with restrictions only applies to Germany. There's no restrictions on what NATO can do anywhere else. So they disagree fiercely over this as they're trying to negotiate what becomes the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And Yeltsin keeps pushing back and saying, no, that document was basically a veto on anywhere else. We meant you could only go to Eastern Germany, nowhere else. And the West says, well, that's not in the document. It's not in the four corners of the document. It only talks about Germany. So Yeltsin belatedly tries in 1997 to get a veto over NATO enlargement, which Gorbachev hadn't gotten in 1990. He fails, but this is key. He starts saying in public that he'd gotten one anyway. So he starts saying, to appease his domestic critics, I got a veto against further NATO expansion. NATO infrastructure is not going to move eastward. American diplomats reach out frantically to the then foreign minister Primakov and to others saying, this isn't true, right? Yeltsin knows this isn't in the documents. And Primakov says, I keep telling him this, but he keeps saying in public they got a veto. So it's a mistake, but he keeps saying it. So in other words, Yeltsin creates this popular sense that Russia got a veto, thus creating another sense of betrayal. So then you get to Putin, who realizes he can instrumentalize all of this history. I don't think he's really concerned about historical accuracy. He doesn't refer to the final settlement of 1990, for example. He refers to the not 1 inch comment and say, look, we were betrayed. And he's targeting 1997. He did it in December. His Russian foreign ministry issued a draft treaty demanding that NATO take its infrastructure back to where it was in 1997. And he did it in his remarks again just this week. 1997 is becoming a real touchstone for Putin. So finally, the phrase not 1 inch. As I've just described, it's most commonly associated with George H.W. Bush and Baker and this 1990 dispute over whether they promised Gorbachev NATO would move not 1 inch eastward. But as I got documents declassified for my book actually covers the whole period between the end of the Cold War and the start of COVID, with a particular focus on the 1990s. As I got documents declassified from the Clinton Library, which took me 3 years of appeals to do and happened despite Kremlin protests. Sidebar, when the Kremlin protested, I knew what I was getting must be good. When presidential spokesman Peskov personally complained to the Clinton Library, I was very excited. And it turned out what I was getting was the Bill Boris bromance in print. It was nearly all transcripts from Clinton-Yeltsin summits. Back to main point, the phrase not 1 inch. As I got these Clinton documents declassified, I realized that the phrase not 1 inch over the course of the 90s gradually took on the opposite meaning. In other words, initially for James Baker, it meant NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. But by the end of the 90s, it had taken on the exact opposite meaning. Washington had realized by then that it could not only win big, it could win bigger. Not 1 inch of Europe needed to be off limits to NATO. There could be an open door basically in perpetuity. Now, if there's one main takeaway from the book, it's that NATO enlargement wasn't one entity, it wasn't one thing. There were multiple ways to enlarge NATO, and they were known at the time. And this decision to go for a manner of expansion that has an endless open door was a conscious choice. There were people pushing back against it at the time. For example, the British said, the way we should expand NATO is we should do it once. We should take our time while Russia is weak, pick some really good allies, expand NATO once and be done, because otherwise it's just going to keep aggravating Russia. And the Americans looked at the Brits and said, no, that is exactly the opposite. We have a strategy encapsulated in the acronym SIBROD, S-I-B-R-O-D, S-I-B-R-O-D. Small is beautiful, robust open door. In other words, we're going to expand to the smallest number of countries and only half of what used to be Czechoslovakia, because we want to make it totally clear that NATO expansion is not an event, not a one-off, but a process. So you Brits are exactly wrong. And then there was a whole nother vision, which I endorse in my book as what I think would have been appropriate, namely the Partnership for Peace, which would have smeared the line that NATO expansion drew across Europe and created less friction with Moscow. So in other words, my argument is not against NATO expansion. My book is not against NATO expansion. I think it was a reasonable response to the pressures of the 90s. Certainly the heroic leaders of protest movements like Solidarity in Poland, Lech Walesa, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, so many others, they had broken free of Soviet control. They had become democracies. They had the right to choose their alliances. And NATO expansion was a reasonable response to that. NATO had expanded in the past and it was going to keep doing it. That was not unprecedented and not unreasonable. The problem was how it happened, this aggressive open door policy. Now, I am on record as referring to Putin as a grim, murderous leader. So I have no sympathy with the Putin regime. But I do see that the open door is problematic. If I were in charge of Russia, I would be concerned about it. I think that is not unreasonable. I think the basic problem here is that a post-Cold War order developed, a post-Cold War security order, without a stake for the largest country in Europe, by which I mean Russia. It doesn't require us to like Putin. I think what he's doing to Ukraine is reprehensible, but it is a reality that Russia is a major European power. It is a reality that 30 years after the end of the Cold War, the US and Russia still control 90% of the nuclear warheads in the world, and Russia is too nuclear to ignore. It is a reality that the US and Russia are the only countries that can essentially end life on Earth. And so to have a European security system with no stake or place for Russia is an unsustainable system. I felt fairly certain it was going to come to a crisis, which is why I wrote and published this book. And now I'm in the surreal position where on the one hand, I'm pleased that intellectually I was on the right track, but as a human being concerned about world peace, I'm deeply, deeply worried. So I'm glad that we are here today to talk about these important issues, especially with my knowledgeable colleague, Michael Kimmage.
Thank you so much, Mary. Both for the remarkable substance of your presentation and of course of the book behind it, and also for posing several key questions in such a sort of clear form. Speaking of questions, let me just mention, not in the spirit of anticlimax, but just to make sure our audience knows that they should be submitted through the email address kennan@wilsoncenter.org, through Twitter at Kennan Institute, or via the Kennan Institute's Facebook page. So let me delve right in with two questions of my own, Mary, and then we will sort of open the conversation to the audience's questions. One thing I wanted to ask you about, since you have such a wealth of detail about the policy decisions, but also the policy imagination of the 1990s, is specifically about the Western side of the story. It's fascinating to hear you discuss the difference between the British and the American approach about enlargement, but I wanted to ask about the expectations that accompanied NATO enlargement in the 1990s. What kind of Europe did these policymakers, whether Stroke Talbot or Bill Clinton, or other sort of the key figures, what kind of Europe did they envision, and how did they think that enlarging NATO would contribute to either the creation or to the validation of that Europe?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for that question. Insightful as always. There were, if I'm focusing on the United States, 3 camps, and I describe all these in detail in my book, Not One Inch. Let me describe each camp briefly as an answer to your question. The first camp, its main representatives were Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, a little bit his predecessor, Secretary of Defense Les Aspin, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Shalikashvili, John Cruzel in the Defense Department. These were people who thought roughly as follows, and I'm paraphrasing Bill Perry here. The exact quotations are in my book, Not One Inch, but this is roughly what Bill Perry summarized, how he put his view to President Clinton. President Clinton, Bill Perry, I have the greatest respect for Central and Eastern Europeans, particularly Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, and the way that they managed to throw off Soviet control. But I, Bill Perry, am the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America. And my job is to keep America safe and make it safer. And I am currently doing a fabulous job because I am engaged in unprecedented collaboration with Moscow to dismantle nuclear weapons that were targeting the United States. This is the greatest nuclear cooperation since the dawn of the atomic age. And I think this is crucial going forward, that this continue. And anything that irritates the Russians, anything that moves their hand back to the trigger finger, that causes them to rethink denuclearizing in this way, is not in the interest of the United States government. So to get to your question, Michael, about, what do you envision in the future? He said, I think it's for the future, it's crucial to prioritize cooperation with Russia above all else. And that will be in the interest not only of Americans, but also of Europeans. So I understand that the Central and Eastern Europeans want to go into NATO, but you've got to make clear to them there's a bigger game here. We need to think long-term about the relationship with Russia. And so personally, I think what we should do with NATO enlargement, rather than draw a new line across Europe, is we should blur that line. We should have an intermediary organization that modulates NATO expansion, saves face for Russia, doesn't maximize frictions with Russia. And that organization is the Partnership for Peace. This is an entity that we're going to create, and we're going to be intentionally vague about its relationship to NATO expansion. That ambiguity is a feature, not a bug. And what we're going to do is we're going to make this organization, the PFP, an institution that has a way to offer a loose affiliation with NATO to a wide array of countries. And then quietly over time, we'll actually bring some through various phases into full membership. But there won't be an obvious beauty contest with an obvious line. We won't immediately draw a new line between Article 5 Europe and non-Article 5 Europe. And by way of explanation for non-NATO experts, Article 5 is the heart of the NATO treaty. It's the article that refers to every member state treating an attack on one as an attack on all. It's one of the most powerful military guarantees in history. So before we give that to a lot of places, we'll have this phased in process to make sure they're interoperable, to make sure they have civilian control over the military and so forth. And President Clinton initially agrees with this view. President Clinton says, yes, that is a good fit for my vision of Europe. I, President Clinton, am conscious of the fact that I have an unbelievable chance, the first time in millennia, to actually create a peaceful order in Europe. I don't think I should just draw a new Article 5 line across Europe right away. I think that we should do this diffuse method, not least because that opens up possibilities to post-Soviet states. Again, this is all still President Clinton. President Clinton said, I'm really concerned that post-Soviet states are being forgotten in the debate over NATO expansion. I, President Clinton, am particularly concerned about Ukraine. It is the linchpin of security in Europe. Now, when I, Mary Sarotte, read that in the documents, I nearly fell out of my chair because it's incredibly prescient. And so President Clinton was saying, we need to offer a birth to Ukraine, and we can't just put Ukraine in NATO in 1993. So this Partnership for Peace is great because it doesn't draw a new line, and it offers a birth for Ukraine, which, by the way, had been born nuclear. It had so much of the Soviet nuclear arsenal on its territory that on the day of independence, it was the third largest nuclear power in the world, which gets attention around the world. So you wanted to do something for Ukraine. So this is an approach that I think would have made more sense than now. Was it perfect? No. At the time, people hated it because it was not as sexy as expanding NATO. The Poles really despised it, the Czechs as well. They really wanted to get into NATO, which is understandable. And as new sovereign democracies, they had that right. But it had a huge advantage. It was minimally acceptable to all stakeholders. And so it actually started working. And I think it was a sound policy. The problem was that there were many people opposed to it, and they had a different vision for Europe. So within the US government, there were two camps that agreed on a policy, which is let's draw a new Article 5 line across Europe as soon as possible, but they disagreed on the reasons. So there were what I call the optimists and what I call the pessimists. So were the optimists who said, we don't have to worry about this because we believe that international organizations confer peace on a region. The more we expand NATO, the more secure everyone will feel, the less conflict there will be. So actually, it's in our interest to start giving out Article 5 as widely as possible because it will calm everyone down. They'll feel so successful, feel so secure. There'll just cease to be conflict in Europe. So this was the optimistic argument. And to a certain sense, Clinton increasingly became swayed by this. Clinton liked the idea, he liked a book called Non-Zero. He liked the idea that there could be win-win solutions, that you could expand NATO and everybody could be happy. Then there was another camp which agreed with the policy, but completely disagreed on the reason. These are the pessimists. The pessimists looked at the optimists and said, those people are idiots, but they're useful idiots because what they say sounds good on camera. we know that Moscow will never change, the Soviet Union and Russia are all the same thing. We need to cage the bear while it's down. We need to stab the bear while it's on its knees. There were all these horrible bear metaphors throughout the documents. For me as a vegetarian, some of them fairly hair-raising, and a lot of violence towards animals in the documents. And the idea was, we need to have neo-containment. This actually appears in the documents. We need containment beyond the Cold War. We're not going to say it in public because that doesn't sell well. So we'll let the optimists make the case for NATO expansion. But we agree we need to give Article 5 to people as soon as possible. And that's a different vision for Europe. And Clinton shifts to that vision. In other words, having figured out the right answer, which was the Partnership for Peace, he then abandons that and goes to what I call all or nothing Article 5 expansion. Partly because his advisors convince him, partly because the Republican Party supports it, and they win big in the November 1994 midterm congressional elections. And Clinton needs those voters if he wants to be reelected. So he knows he has to pay attention to that. Partly because of self-inflicted Russian wounds. A big part of my book is that there is Russian agency here. I'm trying, in a sense, to write a non-triumphalist book about the end of the Cold War and look in a clear-eyed way at both American and Russian actions. And the Russians, under Yeltsin, make some tragic mistakes. Yeltsin starts to shed the blood of his political opponents in Moscow in 1993 and in Chechnya in 1994. And that causes Central and Eastern Europeans to say, oh, wait a minute, this really is just like the old Soviet Union, invading places with violence. Forget this Partnership for Peace we kind of agreed to under duress from Washington. We needed Article 5 yesterday. So all of these things come together, and then Ukraine starts denuclearizing, which makes it a lesser priority. So giving it a berth becomes a lesser priority, unfortunately. And Clinton switches to this all or nothing manner of expansion, which then draws a new line across Europe. So now we're on a very different timeline to a European future than the other ones would have provided. So apologies for the long answer, but it was a great question and there was a lot of substance to it.
Not at all. And I'm delighted to see questions piling up from the audience. So I'll just ask one further one, which is implicit to a few of the questions that have already come in. Ambassador Braithwaite just gave your book a fantastic review in the pages of the Financial Times and argued there something about the situation that we're currently in as inevitable. And going back to your screenwriting reference at the beginning of the conversation, you could sort of put Vladimir Putin at the center of the story. And he appears at the beginning of your book. Of course, he appears at the end of your book, but he's there in Leipzig, perhaps listening to Helmut Kohl's speech about a unified Germany, and sort of that could be the great opening scene of a movie. If you were to do that, though, that would sort of imply that as the drama would come to an end, so it would begin. That, to put it in slightly more technical terms, Russia cannot exist without trying to impose a sphere of influence on its neighbors to the west, and the United States cannot accept a sphere of influence in Europe by Russia's creation or the creation of any other country. And so because you have this explicit and implicit contrast, you're going to have a collision. So I want to ask you about the role that detail, nuance, contingency, twists and turns in the narrative plays, so that you can reflect on this issue of inevitability. It really is of the essence for Western diplomats right now. If this is an inevitable conflict, that means one thing for diplomacy. If it's not quite inevitable or not inevitable, it means another thing. So it's not just a historical question. I would say it's very much a contemporary one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. No, that was very kind of Ambassador Braithwaite to give me such a generous review in the Financial Times. So I hesitate. I'm very hesitant to disagree with him on the inevitability of the conflict. That means, by the way, that I also am disagreeing with George Kennan, the namesake of your institute, who, of course, famously 25 years ago this month said that NATO expansion was the greatest mistake of the post-Cold War period. And the upshot was it would inevitably lead to conflict. Now, although I'm being hosted by the Kennan Institute, I do have to register one complaint with Kennan. Kennan was on the record as saying that women should not be allowed to talk about international relations. And the reason is interesting. Kennan said that when women talk about international relations, they are, quote, too earnest, and it's embarrassing. So, of course, I disagree with Kennan on that front, and it means I am not as enamored of Kennan as perhaps some others might be. And I think that in disagreement with Kennan and Braithwaite, I think the problem wasn't NATO enlargement itself, it was how it happened. as again, just to repeat what I said, one of the takeaways of the book is that NATO enlargement was not one thing. There were multiple ways to enlarge it. And I believe that had we stuck with the Partnership for Peace, in roses with Russia now, but I place where we are now. And at a minimum, we would have an institution that could help us manage contingency in a much greater way, because now all we have is the ability to put Ukraine in NATO or not. It's all or nothing. We don't have a shades of gray contingency management option, which you would have had in the Partnership for Peace. So wouldn't it be great if we could take a time machine back to 1991, which is where I am now. Actually, you see me with Boris Yeltsin on front of the tank when he was the great Democrat, and replay this and actually create some more opportunities to manage contingency today. In essence, a way of thinking about that question of inevitability is by using the theory of the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. And if any of my students are in the audience, they'll groan because they've heard me refer to this before, but I like it as a theory, so I'll mention it again here. Stephen Jay Gould, is an evolutionary biologist, said, I do not actually see gradualism in the fossil record. I don't see sort of a steady pattern of evolutionary change, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here. He said, what I see are really long periods of stasis or equilibrium where relatively little changes. And then I see moments of dramatic change, dramatic punctuation, a punctuational event, such as an asteroid striking the Earth. And the asteroid is so large that it throws a cloud of dust into the atmosphere that cools the Earth, and the dinosaurs can't survive. The dinosaurs die out, and the mammals become dominant. Now, that asteroid discovery was after Stephen Jay Gould died, but it fits into his theory. This idea that you have long periods of stasis or equilibrium where relatively little changes, then this dramatic punctuational event, and then a new equilibrium, in this case, one where mammals become dominant. And the reason I mentioned that in answer to your question, Michael, is that I think another way to think about this is that in international relations, this idea applies, and there are periods where structure dominates, but then there are these moments of change or crisis where contingency or agency dominates. That's what makes it a punctuational moment. And then a new stasis or equilibrium gradually settles in. So when you're in this punctuational moment, I believe there are multiple paths to the future possible, that nothing is inevitable. And that's why they're so important, these moments, because the choices that you make in them help shape the future. And so gradually, as political leaders make choices in that moment, they foreclose options and they get to a certain path to the future. Once you're on that path, then a new equilibrium starts to settle in, then things start to become inevitable. But for that time, that punctuational moment, I think there is no inevitability. It's all contingency. That's why it's important. That's why it's interesting to me as a historian. And so that's why I think that had we made some different choices, both we and Russia, it's not just the West, that we could have been in a better place now. So I do not actually believe in inevitability before a certain point. After a certain point, it becomes hard to change things once you have a new equilibrium.
Thank you so much, Mary. Let me just say, and you'll appreciate this, given your meticulous archival research skills, that the namesake of the Kennan Institute is in fact the uncle of George Kennan, the author of the X article.
So I did not know that. Okay.
Doesn't necessarily get us off the hook for some of the things that George Kennan said, but for the record, the famous traveler in Siberia and author of late 19th century books on Russia. So we have a lot of wonderful, yes, qualified. I have a lot of wonderful questions that I am in the role of reading. Please continue contributing if you have further questions, but we have now 11 on the list. So what I'm going to do, Mary, if it's okay with you, is I'm going to bundle them into groups of 2, and I may have to bundle them into somewhat larger groups just as the clock ticks down. I'll mention who is the asker of the question as well. So let me start with our first question from Ira Strauss, former Kennan short-term scholar, former Fulbright professor at MGIMO and Moscow State University, and lead organizer Committee on Eastern Europe and Russia in NATO, 1992. So Ira Strauss's question is as follows: if the West had responded more favorably to Gorbachev's and Yeltsin's feelers from 1990 to 1994 about joining NATO, do you think we would be in a different situation today? I could throw in, by way of footnote, the very interesting 2002 policy planning memo in the US Department of State speculating about Russia joining NATO. But that's a great question about Russia and NATO membership. And then the second question from David Lane: NATO was formed to counter and deter the Warsaw Pact and its constituent countries. With the dissolution of the pact and the fragmentation of the Soviet Union, please explain why it was necessary for NATO to continue. So that's a big question. So two excellent questions, and pass the baton back to you, Mary.
Actually, let me take them in the reverse order. Thank you for those great questions. Yeah, so the question about NATO, yes, NATO was basically founded in the 1940s, 1950s to keep Soviet tanks out of Western Europe. And so when I started doing research on this topic many years ago, I expected somewhere to find a discussion of saying, after the wall came down, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed, mission accomplished, let's go home. And to this day, I've never really found that discussion in the late 90s. Now, obviously, under President Trump, we started having that discussion in a major way in the United States, to the distress of our NATO allies. And it was carried out in a way that was maximally insulting to our NATO allies and was deeply distressing to people dedicated to the transatlantic partnership, such as Michael and myself. But back in the late 89, 90, 90, 91 period, I did not actually find that discussion, which was surprising to me. I, as a historian, I'm conscious that the United States in the 20th century essentially faced the same challenge 3 times. It tried to reconstruct order in Europe in the wake of a conflict. It tried to do that in 1918, it tried to do that in 1945, and then in a slightly different way after the end of the Cold War in 1989. The reason I mentioned that is obviously in 1918, you ended up with a US that retreated into isolationism. So when the 1945 ordering moment rolled around, the State Department, the NSC, its representatives looked carefully at what went wrong in 1918 to learn its lessons. So you do see in 1945 this study of 1918 to see what should we do to, do better this time. I thought in 1989 I would see a similar looking back to 1945, but I didn't. Instead, what I saw was a sense of, we just won the Cold War. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Things are great. Like, why do we need to change anything? And of course, political scientists know that institutions are sticky, meaning that once an institution comes into being, it almost always persists. So although in the abstract, exactly what the questioner said, you could have had an argument in the abstract about, gee, maybe NATO should disband. Instead, what happened was this assumption of it ain't broke, don't fix it. President George H.W. Bush famously said, I don't do the vision thing. Why bother? We've just won. Let's stick with NATO. Let's even stick with its ability to expand. So there was a strong US preference for sticking with pre-existing security organizations. Now, there were people at the time who pushed back. For example, there were Central and Eastern Europeans, many of them former dissidents who had gone from prisons to the presidencies once their revolution succeeded. And many of these people were pacifists. They had refused to do military service in their countries. And they did not like either the Soviet bloc or the Warsaw Pact or NATO. And many of them who were in positions of political authority said, we should be cognizant of the great historical tragedies that have happened in Central and Eastern Europe. We should, in response, now that we have a chance, we should dissolve the borders in Central and Eastern Europe. We should demilitarize and denuclearize it and create a permanent neutral zone of peace between East and West. Now, you can say that would have been crazy, but that would have been a new world order. And ideas like that made President George H.W. Bush very worried. And he said, we need to rush to make sure we lock in this Cold War order that was so good for the United States. President George H.W. Bush succeeded in doing that. So it wasn't surprising to me that NATO survived. What was surprising to me was that George H.W. Bush successfully labeled it a new world order, since it wasn't. Demilitarizing Central and Eastern Europe would have been a new world order. Disbanding NATO would have been a new world order, but it wasn't. So you have an institution that was fundamentally designed to counter Moscow, persisting into the post-Cold War period. And again, I have no sympathy for Putin, but you can understand why he says, look, I'm worried about this. And then the question about Russian feelers for joining NATO. Yeah, certainly there were Russian feelers for joining NATO. And interestingly, there are many aspects to this question, but in the interest of time, I just want to focus on one, because it's actually very relevant to news that just broke today. When Yeltsin and Clinton, and one of the times when the Billboard bromance was really going strong, talked about potential Russian membership in NATO, Yeltsin said to Clinton, what's going to be a big problem? The Chinese reaction. The Chinese are going to be worried about NATO suddenly moving close to them. So as we talk about putting Russia into NATO, Bill, we're going to have to figure out how to manage the Chinese reaction. And the reason I mention that is just before we went live, I learned that Putin, who is in Beijing for the Olympics, issued a joint statement with Xi. I repeat, a joint statement where they jointly criticized NATO expansion. So in other words, China has now gone on record as saying that it is opposed to NATO enlargement. And that is a real sign of support for Putin, and very difficult for the United States, because if you've got, three big power centers, Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, you don't want two coalescing against you. And now Moscow and Beijing have literally just in the last hour coalesced in written opposition, formal opposition to NATO enlargement. So the story of Russia and NATO is a long and complicated story, and I do describe it in the book. If I talked about it here, we'd be here for 7 hours. So it's a great topic, but I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm going to read now 3 questions, and I'll just invite you to cherry pick, what pieces of them you want to respond to most, because I think it's important to include all of the questions that we've gotten. So from Michael Hertzen, was Gorbachev's view that the KGB was an organization of exceptional virtue and the best and the brightest representative of the population broadly? 4, from Edward Cowan, can you explain whether there is any factual basis for the assertion that in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, NATO or some of its members spoke or acted in a way that could be construed as undertaking not to expand membership into Eastern Europe? And then 3rd and final question for this round, in 1962, the US was adamant about not allowing any Russian missiles in Cuba, so close to our border. Does not Putin have a valid concern about NATO missiles and troops eventually being placed in Ukraine near his border and perhaps within other nations bordering Russia? This from Jonathan Simon. All right, you have your work cut out for you.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure. The first one, I wasn't quite sure I heard a question in it. Gorbachev and the KGB exceptional virtue, what was the, okay.
I think it may have been a little bit more of a comment. I would just take the other 2. Mary, you have to unmute.
As I mentioned in my opening remarks, and as I describe in more detail in the book, Not One Inch, yeah, there are a host of conversations where the words NATO will move not 1 inch eastward or other similar phrases come up. So certainly that, it's not wrong to say that it came up. One way to think about it, this is a spectrum. This debate about NATO enlargement, for too long, it's been binary, and I'm trying to move beyond the binary. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, you have, let's say, the extreme Russian position, which is we were absolutely betrayed. It's crystal clear. You cannot trust the West. Putin has even said this in speeches. He says the biggest problem now is we know we can't trust betrayers. So how can we even negotiate anything? So that's the absolute Russian position. They have the absolute position at the other end. This is, the idea that it's a complete myth. The Russians are psychotic. This never came up. I don't know. They're just imagining it. It's a false memory, right? It's just completely fictitious. And unsurprisingly, when you get into the historical evidence and look at it, what actually happened was somewhere in between. Right. So repeatedly in the 90s, discussions about limiting NATO's movement come up. But what is formalized in legally binding treaties is often quite different. As I said, the legally binding treaty that unified Germany explicitly allows Article 5 to move eastward across the Cold War line. Now with restrictions, but it allows it to happen, which is an important precedent. It's the precedent of crossing the line. The 1997 agreement is not legally binding. Again, there are assurances about what NATO will do, but this is not legally binding. It was not a veto over NATO expansion. So it gets to this tension between what is discussed and what is written down. And to some degree, it's a debate over what the word promise means, which is more a psychological debate than historical debate. My personal take is that when you are dealing with high-level international relations, so agreements between states, you really need to get what's important to you in writing. So what I try to do in my work is clarify what was agreed to in writing and signed onto by Moscow, but then also provide the context of what was actually discussed. So in my research, in addition to using the documents that I got declassified, I also did over 100 interviews to ask people, what was it that you discussed that wasn't written down? So certainly it came up, but then you also have to look at what is signed in writing. Yeah, and then to go to the other question on potential nuclear forces in Ukraine and justified concerns. Yes, just to emphasize again, to say one more time, I have no sympathy with the Putin government. But again, if I were the leader of a country, certainly I'm concerned about where missiles could be in place that might threaten my country. In particular, I think this might offer a possibility, an opportunity, if you will, for ending the crisis, because I think it would be in both Moscow's interest and in the West's interest if we could reactivate at least some of two treaties that we all unwisely tore up. It's some from Washington's side, some from Moscow's side. That's the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Conventional Forces on Europe Treaty. I think that if both sides would be willing to talk about restoring some of those provisions, it could go a long way to ending this crisis. And by the way, another recent development that I think has not received enough attention, the Spanish newspaper El País has leaked the American responses to the written responses from last week that were given to Moscow in response to its draft treaties. And again, Putin really wants everything in writing because of the way Gorbachev and Yeltsin didn't get things in writing. So if the El País leak is accurate, I don't know if it is, but it seems to me that these documents are accurate. The US has said now to Moscow that it is willing to produce written signed instruments, yes, quote, written signed instruments about the future of European security. That seems to me to be a pretty serious opening, because that is what Putin wants, these written signed agreements. And so if there was some way that it could be written down and signed that there won't be intermediate range forces, nuclear forces in Ukraine, that could address Putin's concern. I mean, the real tragic irony here is that NATO is not about to make Ukraine or Georgia members. NATO is not about to put next generation intermediate range nuclear forces in Ukraine. And NATO is not about to use conventional or other forces to invade Russia. And yet we may be about to have a war where huge numbers of Ukrainians die over that possibility. And that's just too tragic for words. So we need to make clear that NATO does not want to do these things. And if the US is willing to sign instruments to that effect, perhaps that is a way out of this crisis. I firmly believe, by the way, that Putin will not invade before the end of the Beijing Olympics. He will not steal the spotlight from Xi. He needs Xi too much. And not least because back in 2008, the last time China had the Olympics, Russia invaded Georgia on August 1st, 2008, thus stealing the spotlight from the Chinese Olympics, which started on August 8th, 2008. And the Chinese were not pleased, and let that be known. So with Putin there, getting a hero's welcome, issuing joint statements against NATO with Xi, I simply cannot see Russia invading during Xi's big party. I don't have any classified information on that. That's just pure speculation on my part, but I would be willing to bet a large amount of money that it won't happen. So we have breathing space until the Olympics end on February 20th. And I hope we can negotiate treaties that in essence revive some of the INF and some of the CFE to help prevent Ukrainians from dying.
Thank you, Mary. And certainly there's lots of diplomatic meetings planned for the next couple of weeks. As a footnote to what you're saying about Putin's attitudes, there was a good piece in the New York Times this morning about not Putin's attitudes toward NATO, but sort of Russian attitudes toward NATO. And they're not very warm. And that's, a part of the story as well. Obviously, Putin has decision-making powers that are unique, but he's also part of a political culture that dictates his options as much as he, is deciding upon them himself. I think what I'm going to do, Mary, is I'm going to ask you all the remaining questions, and then again, you can sort of choose which elements of them you want to most respond to, and then we'll draw today's event to a close. Please feel free to, go a few minutes beyond 1 p.m. We don't have to stick to that deadline exactly, but we'll try to end things close to that moment. So let me start with Bill Hill, Kennan Global Fellow. On the issue of aims and motivations of the U.S. and Eastern European leaders in 1990, how do you evaluate the claims that issues such as the withdrawal of 500,000 Soviet troops from Eastern Europe for the U.S. and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact for the Eastern Europeans were at least as important and perhaps more urgent than NATO's potential enlargement? The implication being that complaints about an alleged broken promise stem from later discontent and disillusion with the eventual architecture of the post-Cold War security order. Another question, doesn't the open door, this is from Paul Meyer, adjunct professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University, doesn't the open door policy regarding new members go back to Article 10 of the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty? Certainly an important historical question. From Scott Tusley, from Non-Lugar Program Manager, who had been in Moscow between 1995 and 1997. How should we be approaching negotiation, even be approaching negotiation with a clearly totalitarian, ruthless, eternal leader, completely different from many decades of predecessors? Here's a question from Ted Ling, Wilson Fellow. Robert Zoellick did a Wilson Center event a few days ago. I think it would be fair to say that he scoffed at the idea that Western powers had ever pledged not to enlarge NATO. For example, he said, by way of paraphrase, that we shouldn't forget that Putin was a KGB officer and skilled at disinformation. However, what you have described shows the issue was more complicated. So my question is, have you found in your research that Western participants in the negotiations are now being misleading? And that's an important question because some of the history of NATO enlargement has been written by people who are participants in the process. From Ann Phillips, former Wilson Center public policy scholar, what aid did the US and the West provide the USSR in exchange for Moscow's agreements to the terms of German unification? Was the promise of massive aid met? And then finally, from Irakli Sirbaladze, in your book, you bring light is a particle, light is a wave this analogy, and you say that Washington's highest priority should be the peoples formerly dominated by Moscow. Washington's highest priority should be Moscow, both at the same time. Can both be done at the same time? It's a perfect question because it goes right to your opening paragraphs of the book. So that's it from our end. The floor is now yours before we thank you for your book and participation and draw today's event to a close.
I was gonna say, so we're not extending for the next 6 hours, so I can address all of these. Okay. Yeah, no, terrific questions. I mean, obviously, with 4 minutes, I'm not gonna be able to address all these questions. So these are all terrific. Let me just pick a few things out. First of all, shout out to Bill Hill, who is a wonderful book, No Place for Russia. I strongly recommend to everyone. Your point are complaints about a broken promise. Do they stem from later discontent? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, as I've talked about in my talk, Moscow signed a document that contained the opposite of a non-expansion pledge. Moscow signed a document that allowed Article 5 to move eastward, and by the way, that caused considerable consternation among Gorbachev's advisors. One of them ultimately committed suicide. Gorbachev, I have great respect for him. I think he deserved a Nobel Prize. But when you get into the sources, you see that he was actually a terrible negotiator, and his team knew it. As a matter of fact, there was a famous moment at a U.S.-Soviet summit in May 31st, June 1st, 1990, where Gorbachev was just giving things away left, right, and center, and his negotiating team in the White House in front of President Bush and National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft started to contradict Gorbachev. Brent Scowcroft later said, I felt like I was watching a palace coup in real time. And so his advisors, particularly Valentin Falin, said, you've got to push for this NATO enlargement and minimum minimorum. You've got to get the nuclear weapons out of divided Germany. You've got to make sure nuclear weapons don't come any closer to Russia. And by the way, Michaela, you'd have public opinion on your side. The West Germans, in the 1980s, went out on the streets in their hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to protest nuclear weapons. You, Mikhail Gorbachev, you should say, Germans, you want to unify? You know what the price is? Get rid of the foreign nuclear weapons. Then you can unify. A majority of West Germans would have said, we would be thrilled to take that deal. So Valentin Falin kept pressing Gorbachev to do that, and he wouldn't. And he seemed like he prioritized more being part of the big club of global leaders and getting along with them than really pressing Soviet advantages in these negotiations. And so Moscow signed on to these documents. And then certainly what happens later, especially what's going on right now, I think Putin right now is saying, I want a do-over. I'm going to hold Ukrainians hostage until I get a do-over because I could do better than Gorbachev, certainly, and better than Yeltsin. So yes, no, that is absolutely right. Then the question about the open door and its grounding in the NATO treaty. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point is that obviously countries can apply to join NATO, and NATO can decide whether it wants them or not. The real question is, what is the stated policy of Washington towards enlargement, which is what Putin cares about? And And this initial status where there was going to be, instead of drawing a hard new line, you're going to smear the line by having the Partnership for Peace. It would have accomplished the same thing in the end. All these places would have become members of NATO, but it would have caused less friction. So it's more about a presentation than anything else. And then let me just close on Bob Zoellick. Obviously, the other questions are great too, but we're just running out of time. They close on Bob Zoellick. Bob Zoellick was hugely helpful to me with my book. He gave me multiple interviews. He even read parts of the book that were related to his participation in events, so I could make sure I had understood them correctly. I don't agree with this idea of scoffing at the Russians. Look, the lives of Ukrainians are hanging in the balance, and more than that, by the way, if this conflict escalates. And that's what's really scary. If there's, for example, airstrikes and Russian aircraft are straying into international airspace while they're in acquisition mode, and they start to, lock on to, NATO aircraft have a right of self-defense. There's a lot of very scary escalation scenarios. There's also very scary refugee scenarios. So, I think that things are getting really serious now. I don't think we should scoff. I think we should be clear that these issues came up. We should work on a shared narrative of the evidence that I've tried to present in my book, Not One Inch. But we should say, look, what we need to do is go forward, and it will be in your interest and ours to prevent this war in Europe. It will be in your interest and ours to revive parts of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, as I've already said. In your interest and ours to revive the conventional forces in Europe. Basically, in your interest and ours to revive that cooperation, that moment of optimism, if we can, that existed in the 90s, to try to go back to a potential for peace in Europe. I think we have a window of opportunity until the end of the Chinese Olympics, and I think that we should seize it.
Well, Mary, it's been a privilege to have you with us in the long view for the past hour. I'll say, by way of one further statement of praise for your book, I think it would have been a masterpiece whenever it was published because of the caliber of the research and the wonderful writing, not Hollywood-esque in tone, but riveting from the first to the last page, and all of that will just stand the test of time for what the work truly is, a work of history, exactly as you're articulating in response to the question about Robert Zoellick, that we need a credible historical record before we can really do anything else. But I'm especially happy that this masterpiece has appeared at this present moment. You're offering policymakers really what they most need, which is a firm intellectual foundation, which I think does begin with history. And events and decision making will take their course, but you've given this audience, you've given all of us who care about these issues a wonderful book, a wonderful gift, and you've also given it to the policymakers who are in the midst of, exactly as you're describing, immensely consequential decisions. So thank you once again for your time. Thanks again for the book. I will hold it up to our audience just as sort of visual reinforcement, and we hope that we will be back soon with your next book whenever it comes out so that we can talk about it on the long view. Thanks so much, Mary.